What if Moses never freed Israel from Egypt? Picture a midnight without a whisper of wind, the sea as smooth as poured glass, and the moon painting a silver road from shore to shore. No staff raised, no wall of water, no frantic footprints pressed into wet sand. Torches flicker on the Nile instead, their reflections trembling like uncertain hearts. If the most famous door in the Bible, the door from bondage to freedom, never opened, what echoes would that silence send through faith, culture, and history? To ask this question, we first need to remember the road as it is told. Israel had grown numerous in Egypt, the land that had once sheltered them in famine. But favor turned to fear. A new Pharaoh, the story says, forgot Joseph and enslaved the Hebrews, pressing them into brick-making and building, a people bent under the sun with backs that learned the language of whips. In that darkness, a child survived the waters in a basket and grew up in Pharaoh's house. He was named Moses. When he came of age, he saw injustice, struck an Egyptian oppressor, and fled into the wilderness. There, among sheep and desert winds, he saw a different kind of fire, one that burned but did not burn up. A voice spoke from the bush, naming itself I Am, and sent Moses back to Egypt with a message simple and shattering: let my people go. Moses returned with his brother Aaron, and the story spins into signs, confrontations, and plagues. Water turned to blood, frogs and gnats swarmed, darkness fell at noon, and finally grief itself entered Egypt's homes. Pharaoh relented, and the Israelites packed their lives into a night called Passover, eating in haste, blood marking their doors. Then came the miracle many can picture with closed eyes: the Red Sea parting, a path where none should be, a wall of water held up by a breath of power. Israel crossed and the waters returned, closing a chapter of slavery and opening one of covenant. At Mount Sinai, thunder spoke law, love of God, love of neighbor, and a people was shaped by wilderness, wisdom, and promise. From this exodus, a culture and faith unfurled that would bless the world with songs, stories, and a fierce memory. We were slaves, and now we are free. Now, what if the turning point turns the other way? Imagine this alternate thread. Moses meets the bush, hears the call, but the weight of his past and the tremor in his voice anchor his feet. Who am I that I should go? He asks in the canonical story. In our version, the question does not dissolve under reassurance. The desert keeps him. He returns to his flocks and grows old with a quiet ache that no song relieves. Back in Egypt, the Hebrew sighs become a normal part of the city's background noise, like the creak of rope and the clatter of chariots. In this timeline, freedom does not arrive with a night of packed bags. Pharaoh never wakes to grief that breaks royal will. Instead, small changes flicker. A few brave elders petition overseers for shorter quotas during flood seasons. An Egyptian scribe sympathetic to their plight records the petitions. A middling official experiments with incentives to increase productivity rather than punishment. Egypt, pragmatic as the Nile's flood, finds it cheaper to keep workers healthy. The whip, while not banished, loosens its bite. Relief comes not with a staff, but with statistics. Meanwhile, the God of the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, does not vanish. Without Sinai's trumpet and tablets, the faith of the Hebrews curls inward like a candle flame cupped by hands. It becomes a household fidelity, a whispered Shema taught at dusk, a story told in courtyards of a God who hears, who sees, who remembers. A mother kneads bread while telling her child of a promise of land, though the child has never laid eyes on it. The words do not stamp a nation into being, they braid a people into a stubborn remembrance. Their sanctuaries are small and portable. A clean table, a set-apart corner, a 7-branched lamp hammered from memory rather than from gold. Egypt shifts too. The presence of a large, resilient minority tests and then refines the empire's identity. Festivals multiply at the edges of formal temples. Market stalls sell amulets carved with falcons next to tiny carvings that say simply, "He is." The Hebrews keep their festivals in miniature, not as a commemoration of a night of flight, but as a night of longing, a vigil of hope. Perhaps once a year, families share a humble meal in a spirit of not yet. It is not the Passover of roasted lamb and bitter herbs prescribed after deliverance, but something quieter, a night when candles are lit early and prayers speak of open doors they have never walked through. In this, a peculiar strength grows, an identity that survives without borders. Without the Exodus, the Promised Land remains a promise, a horizon seen with inner eyes. There is no Joshua crossing the Jordan with a nation at his back, no ancient battles to retell. Canaan remains a patchwork of city-states, trading and raiding as city-states do, while Egypt's influence ebbs and flows across them, like the tide of the Mediterranean. And because there is no conquest, there is no early kingdom of David to sing over, no lion-faced Jerusalem, no temple stones polished by pilgrims. The psalms that once rose from priests in white linen now hum out of rough throats in alleyways along the Nile, songs of exile without exile, belonging without belonging. From this, law evolves differently. Without Sinai, there are no tablets inscribed with the 10 Commandments delivered in thunder and smoke. But the moral grain of that law does not vanish. Conscience has a way of writing itself on people who are pressed together. The Hebrews gather wise sayings born of daily living. Do not bear false witness in the market. Do not move a neighbor's boundary stone in the fields outside Memphis. Give rest to your ox and to the strangers too. These are not gathered into a single code on a mountain, but into scrolls composed in crowded rooms where reeds scratch papyrus by oil light. Justice, in this alternate world, grows like irrigation channels dug by hand. And what of the great ripples history comes to know? Move forward across centuries. Without a nation centered around Jerusalem, the shape of Judaism changes. It is less temple and sacrifice, more home and gathering, less priestly procession, more kitchen table wisdom. The earliest synagogues in our timeline born near and after the exile to Babylon might emerge much sooner as an organic solution inside Egypt, fostered by people who need portable faith. Rabbis as teachers may arise earlier as well, not because a temple fell, but because a temple never stood. Debate and dialogue become the walls and roof of a people's sacred place. Their greatest pilgrimage is from one neighbor's house to another in hard times, sharing food and words that warm better than cedar fires. Without the Exodus, a crucial thread in the tapestry of Christianity frays and rewinds. The Last Supper, as it is told, is a Passover meal, its symbols thick with earlier meaning. In this alternate history, there is no ritual and narrative of deliverance like that to frame later faith. If centuries later a teacher rises in Judea, his metaphors change. Freedom from bondage is still a human ache, but the language that wraps it is different. Instead of the sea parting, perhaps the central image becomes a river crossed by trust alone, or a night in which lamps stay lit despite stronger winds than usual. Parables lean less on kings and temples, more on households and neighbors, on a God who sets a table in a cramped upstairs room and calls it holy in its smallness. The idea of covenant does not vanish. It becomes intimate, like ink on a palm instead of stone on a mountain. Islam's memory of Moses would shift too. The Quranic narrative cherishes prophets who call people back to God and remembers Moses as a conduit of law and liberation. In our What If, Moses becomes a different kind of prophet in the shared memory of the region, more shepherd and sage than lawgiver and liberator. His story, less about a nation taken out and more about a people held together, feeds a different stream in the spiritual landscape. Endurance over escape, transformation within instead of exodus without. There are political and cultural reverberations we can trace like cracks across old clay. Without a remembered liberation from tyranny, the ancient Mediterranean loses one of its most potent archetypes. The idea that a people can walk out. Revolts still happen. Human beings rarely let chains sit undisturbed. But the songs of revolt, the speeches, the letters, the whispered stories told under occupation, lack that foundational example of seawater hung like walls. Later law codes still prohibit murder and theft. These rules live in every civilization. But they do not carry the same backstory about a God who once heard cries and intervened at scale. For Egyptians, the absence of a humiliating loss in the story strengthens continuity. Egypt remains a superpower not only in stone but in narrative, the place where problems are solved inside the system instead of through rupture. At this point, it is fair to ask, which fork strikes you as most believable? Moses declining the call, or a slow, negotiated easing of oppression that keeps Israel in Egypt? Tell me what you think below. And if these respectful, careful what-ifs stir your imagination, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next journey we take together. With that in mind, Imagine art and literature turning under this new sky. The greatest festival in Hebrew memory is no longer a reenacted flight with bitter herbs and hurried bread, but a candle-lit vigil for patience. Poets of the Nile write in both languages, weaving Egyptian imagery of lotus and falcon with Hebrew praise of the one unseen. A child's first question every year is not, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" but "When will the night become a morning?" The answer is an embrace, a story of a God who walks slowly and never loses count. Without a unified kingdom in ancient Israel, the rise of certain empires plays differently. Assyria and Babylon still extend their arms, but the target changes. There is no Jerusalem to besiege as a capital, so campaigns focus on ports and trade routes. Some Hebrew families, weary of waiting, migrate north to Phoenician cities and south to Cush, carrying their compact faith like a traveling chest. Instead of a single exile and return that stamps identity, there are many little exiles and many little returns, like a tide that never settles. Over centuries, this produces a diaspora before the word exists for it. A map full of small red threads spreads out from the Nile. Philosophy and law pick up subtle differences too. Greek thinkers, encountering Egypt as they historically did, meet not only high temples and animal-headed gods, but also dinner-table monotheists who ask incisive questions. Conversations unfold in Alexandria's scholars' quarters about unity and plurality, the one and the many, not just as metaphysics, but as the daily experience of a minority people living distinctly without a border. Stoics hear ideas about inner freedom early. Cynics carry simple proverbs learned from Hebrew craftsmen who close their shops one day in 7 without a state decree to protect that choice. The phrase Sabbath becomes a borrowed word for a human right rather than a national commandment. Centuries later, the absence of the Exodus as a cultural anchor changes the shape of liberation movements. When enslaved people in various eras search their scriptures for a story to sing in fields and prisons, they find endurance, stubborn hope, and table fellowship more than a parted sea. Their songs ask less for a sudden road through water and more for a fire that won't burn out. "Let my people go" is not a banner phrase. Perhaps instead a different line takes hold. "Teach our feet to stand." It inspires a different style of protest, patient, relentless, communal, rooted in the belief that identity can endure any empire's weather. Of course, some things likely remain the same, because the human heart tends to do what the human heart has always done. People still tell stories to survive. Parents still teach children to say please and thank you and sorry, and to look up at stars and think of promises. Empires still grow and crack. Wisdom still travels faster than armies, passing hand to hand inside jokes and recipes and lullabies. The absence of one miraculous night does not eliminate miracle. It changes where we look for it. Instead of pointing to the ocean, people point to the courage it takes to wake up under the same ceiling and still choose kindness. In all this, let's keep something clear and gentle. We are imagining, not rewriting sacred reality. Dates and details shift depending on which historian you ask, and communities hold these stories not as fragile artifacts, but as living memory. Our scenario honors that by asking what values remain, even if the expected path does not. What is law without Sinai? What is freedom without a border crossing? What is worship without a temple? The answer across our speculative map is that faith becomes interpersonal. Law becomes shared wisdom. Freedom becomes neighborly dignity. Worship becomes the way you set a table and welcome whoever knocks at your door. Return with me to the shore of that unparted sea. The waves hum their low, eternal hymn. In the distance, ships move along the safe currents, their sails catching a wind too gentle to ruffle the surface into walls. Moses, in our alternate world, perhaps stands on a different shore far inland, older and quieter, watching sheep sip water. He remembers a fire that did not burn out and feels a twinge of longing that never learned the taste of triumph. But he also knows, in this imagining, that the God who burns without consuming still chooses small things. A word shared between two workers, a day of rest dared into existence by an enslaved family, a kindness that no overseer can stop. By the end of our journey, we notice something else as well. Without that one explosive act of liberation, the story of the Hebrews becomes a masterclass in slow faith. The culture they bless the world with in this timeline is a craft more than a crusade, meticulous, patient, portable. It infuses the Mediterranean with a quiet, holy stubbornness. It teaches civilizations to build freedom into ordinary days, rather than to expect it as a festival of escape. It sends into history not a trumpet blast from Sinai, but a chorus of small voices that never go silent. And when later generations finally do walk out of any Egypt, literal or metaphorical, they carry this wisdom with them. The road to freedom is not only paved by parted seas, but by 1,000 daily acts of covenant kept in corners and kitchens, markets and marriages. So if Moses never freed Israel from Egypt, the sea would stay still, but the story would not. It would flow another way, along canals dug by patience, through neighborhoods held together by memory, across centuries guided by a God whose most common miracle is endurance. And maybe that is the quiet invitation our what if leaves us with tonight. Whether we step onto a dry seabed with the wind at our backs, or we wait long years while waters refuse to move, there is a sacred way to live, faithful, compassionate, and ready for the moment when the door, however it finally opens for more than just ourselves.